Welcome to our afternoon session. We have 3 panels this afternoon. You thought the morning was interesting. The afternoon will be, I think, equally so. My name is Deepak Ramlachan. I'm the Director of the Division of Engineering and Logistics in the Office of Electric Reliability. Our afternoon panels will focus on the potential electric reliability implications of EPA's proposed action in EPA docket OAR 2023-0072, entitled New Source Performance Standards for Greenhouse Gas Emissions from New and Reconstructed Electric Generating Units, and Emission Guidelines for Greenhouse Gas Emissions from Existing Electric Generating Units. The first panel will be a discussion among Commission and EPA staff. Joining us today are Mr. Joseph Goffman. He is the Principal Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Office of Air and Radiation at EPA, and Mr. Tomas Carbonell, Deputy Assistant Administrator for Stationary Sources, and they are accompanied today by EPA staff Stephanie Grumet. Megan Greenfield is not at the table, and Kevin Culligan, along with Mikhail Adiamantiadis. They will provide an overview of the proposed rule and highlight specific issues relevant to the reliable planning and operation of the bulk power system. Before hearing from our panelists, Mr. Chairman, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. It won't surprise anyone here in this room that I'm going to start with electric reliability. Simply put, ensuring reliability is and always must be job one for this commission. That is the lens through which I intend to approach this afternoon's discussion. That means, among other things, that the resources needed to reliably, responsibly, and affordably operate the grid must be there today, tomorrow, and in the long term, including during the severe weather events that can no longer be called unusual or unanticipated, and the over decades-long future that is addressed in the proposed rule. For half a century, EPA has set and enforced the emission standards that apply to every power plant in the nation. We remind ourselves again at the outset of this conference that our piece of the electric power puzzle is defined by the Federal Power Act. We do not build, certificate, or authorize the construction or retirement of power resources. That responsibility lies with the states. We also do not have the authority to second-guess EPA's regulatory choices. Instead, our goal with this technical conference is to better understand how these rules may affect resources and the grid going forward, acknowledging that predicting the future in the energy sector decades in advance has always been a fraught task. Now, during a period of rapid changes in technology, weather conditions, economics, and the law, that task has become even more difficult. Our job is to consider tools available to us under the statutory mandate to accommodate this very fluid new environment and to address reliably the new rules of the road that are being created by the states and by EPA. In this regard, the industry stakeholders and state regulators who are here today are our partners in continuing the evolution of the nation's energy and environmental future. With that in mind, I want to welcome Joe Goffman, the Principal Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Office of Air and Radiation at our sister agency, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Joe's depth of experience with the Clean Air Act is nearly unparalleled, and we are fortunate to have him and his team here today to talk about this important matter. That is enough for me now. I'll have more to say later, and I'll turn it to my colleagues if they have any brief opening remarks.
No, nothing. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Christie. Back to you, Deepa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Panelists, we're ready for you. Mr. Goffman, a reminder, red means your mic is live, so remember to turn it on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First, let me start by thanking you for pointing out that I should turn my mic on. Second, let me thank you for pronouncing Misha's last name. And third, thank you for saying absolutely every single word in the title of this proposal so that you don't have to listen to me do it again, so I appreciate it. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to have this discussion with you and your colleagues. And I'd certainly like to greet Commissioner Clements and Commissioner Danley and Commissioner Christie, and actually wish Commissioner Christie happy Veterans Day, and thank Commissioner Danley and Commissioner Clements and Commissioner, all four of you really, for taking time to talk to us a few months ago and in a couple of cases earlier this week. And we'll do everything we can to lay out what's a very complicated picture of what we're trying to accomplish, which includes what you all are trying to accomplish, as is also the case with your colleagues in balancing authorities and system operators focused on grid reliability. Let's start with the first things first from an EPA perspective. The proposed carbon pollution standards are, in fact, crucial to addressing the urgent need to reduce climate destabilizing carbon dioxide pollution from the power sector. And an important part of the agency's broader efforts to address the multiple health and environmental impacts of the power sector while supporting the continued delivery of reliable and affordable electricity. I want to highlight two or three key principles that are sort of the organizing principles of our overall approach to this and other power sector rulemakings and to today's discussion. First, I want to start by embracing the central topic of today's conference and of this afternoon's agenda, which is ensuring that our nation's electricity system continues to reliably deliver affordable energy to businesses and households. And in that vein, I would like to recognize FERC and you, Chairman Phillips, as well as your colleagues, for the Commission's own ongoing efforts to support the reliability of the grid, including FERC's recent work to address extreme cold weather preparedness, the Commission's much anticipated Order 2023 on improvements to generator interconnection procedures, and the Commission's grid reliability guidelines for inverter-based resources. Those are just two or three examples that we are following in your efforts to maintain grid and enhance, actually, grid reliability. Now, in EPA's own decades of work to address air pollution in the power sector, we have committed ourselves to designing and implementing regulations to serve the public's dual needs of healthful air quality and reliable and affordable electricity. That work continues through the proposal we are examining here today to set standards and guidelines for power sector CO2 emissions, a proposal that we tried to structure so that it provided the features and flexibilities instrumental to ensuring reliability as pollution reductions are achieved. Second, in issuing the proposal, we also embraced not only the imperative of EPA's mission to protect public health and the environment, but also the priorities set by President Biden and by Congress through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. Fossil fuel-fired power plants are the nation's second largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. They emit approximately 20% of our nation's total CO2 and did so at least in 2021 alone. These emissions are helping fuel an escalating climate crisis that is already having devastating impacts on Americans across the country in the form of extreme heat, wildfires, floods, and rising sea levels. And many of these impacts are falling hardest on our most vulnerable communities and communities of color. In fact, NOAA estimated that extreme weather events in 2022 caused more than $165 billion in damages from hurricanes, tornadoes, flooding, droughts, wildfires, and winter storms. And as everyone here knows, many of these impacts also have direct and adverse consequences for the reliability of the electric grid itself. So reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the power sector, which is the object of the proposal we're discussing today, is an essential part of combating the climate crisis and mitigating these impacts. Acting under its responsibility to address significant sources of air pollution under Section 111 of the Clean Air Act, EPA issued the proposal for new and existing fossil fuel-fired power plants in May of this year. And we built it on extensive outreach to and engagement with a broad range of stakeholders, including power companies representing a broad cross-section of the industry. EPA projects the proposal would have significant benefits, reducing CO2 emissions from the power sector by at least 617 million metric tons through 2042, above and beyond reductions anticipated under other policies, and yielding significant health benefits, including, for example, 1,300 premature deaths avoided in 2030 alone. Meanwhile, through the passage of historic bills like the VIL and the IRA, Congress has affirmed a set of urgent priorities allied to the urgent task of reducing pollution by providing an unprecedented $369 billion in incentives and investments to provide a glide path toward a clean, low-carbon energy future. The carbon pollution standards proposal builds on these incentives and investments, including in CCS and clean hydrogen, and supports their uptake while reinforcing and actualizing the clean energy policy signals sent by Congress. Finally, we enthusiastically embrace the process of engagement that today's conference exemplifies. We appreciate hearing from the members of the Commission and from Commission staff, as well as the various experts and stakeholders who are participating in today's panels. Over many decades of successfully regulating air pollution from the power sector, EPA has found that this kind of engagement is instrumental in helping us craft well-designed policies that protect public health while enabling power companies to keep the lights on. And as I'll discuss today, today's meeting is part of an ongoing and comprehensive effort by EPA to ensure that we are listening to and incorporating input from a variety of stakeholders with expertise in and responsibility for maintaining reliability. To provide the Commission with information helpful not just to today's discussion and conference, but also to your own consideration going forward, I'm going to turn to a few topics related to the proposed rule specifically. I want to talk about how EPA is continuing to engage with a range of counterparts, experts, and stakeholders on reliability issues, including the Department of Energy, the Commission, commissioners and staff, yourselves, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, regional transmission organizations, and independent system operators, as well as with individual power companies and balancing authorities across the nation. We're committed to continuing that engagement over the coming weeks and months so that we can ensure that we arrive at a final rule for reducing climate pollution from the power sector that is effective, that's workable, and is fully compatible with maintaining reliable and affordable electricity. I'm confident that we will achieve these goals simply because we have an extensive track record in addressing other forms of pollution from the power sector, engaging in sustained interaction with experts including especially those responsible for maintaining the reliability system and achieving significant reductions from the power sector. For example, we'll cite the mercury and air toxic standards, which not only achieve significant pollution reduction, but had built into the rule at final specific suggestions and approaches that were suggested to us or presented to us by a group of RTOs and ISOs. And as recently as this year, when we finalized the Good Neighbor Plan, we included there specific features, flexibilities, compliance, timeline adjustments, and other devices that were brought to us by our counterparts in the electricity grid. And I guess I would say that through the work that we did over the years on rules like the Good Neighbor Plan and MATS, we learned how to learn from experts such as yourselves, as well as from system operators and balancing authorities. And we're continuing to learn based on those lessons, not just up until this point, but we anticipate, in fact, we're committed to continuing that learning going forward as we finalize the carbon pollution standards. I want to get to a couple of details about the proposal that I think are the most effective way of showing first what we think we've learned from the most recent round of engagement running up to the proposal, what we're in the process of engaging on as we look at all the comments that were submitted and our follow-up discussions with commenters, and which we think will provide the building blocks of a final rule that will achieve the dual commitment that I referred to, which is workable, successful pollution reduction while maintaining a reliable source of electricity. So let me go through what we consider to be, for the moment at least, the 6 key features that of addressing reliability built into the proposals. The first is that, well, we didn't take a one-size-fits-all approach. We varied the requirements applicable to the different categories of covered fossil fuel plants based on their utilization profile, or if you will, their role or their differential roles in the electricity system, imposing the most ambitious requirements on those plants that were or are destined to run the longest and or the hardest, and imposing less stringent requirements on plants that are run only intermittently or have retirement on their horizon. But that's only just the basics for setting a flexible regime. Let me just name 5 or 6 additional features. We intend with this proposal, and we'll certainly consolidate this at final, is to provide ample lead time for compliance. As proposed, the compliance deadlines in this rule do not take effect until 2030 for existing coal-fired power plants. And for the subset of natural gas-fired power plants that are subject to standards based on CCS or low GHG hydrogen, compliance would not be required until 2032 or 2035. A second feature is what we consider to be a flexible architecture for gas units. The proposal would apply less stringent standards to units that are operated less frequently and allow units to move among different tiers of compliance requirements depending on how much they need to run. We think this provides considerable flexibility for power companies to build and operate gas-fired combustion turbines that are needed for reliability purposes. A third feature is the use of subcategories in the design of the standards for existing coal units. Based on contributions and discussions and input from industry, EPA proposed that only the minority of coal-fired power plants that intend to operate until 2040 or beyond would be subject to standards based on CCS. Plants that are intended to or destined to retire closer in time would be subject to standards based on routine maintenance and not be required to invest in additional controls. A fourth feature of flexibility is actually inherent in the state planning process that Section 111D of the Clean Air Act authorizes. States are the ones who have the authority to examine the remaining useful life of a unit and develop source-specific considerations which may result in less stringent standards of performance or longer compliance schedules. A fifth feature that we propose is for units that are subject to a standard of performance based on their utilization, operations that take place during reliability events would not be counted for purposes of determining compliance. And then finally, we adopted an approach that is included in the mercury and air toxic standards. Here we proposed a transparent mechanism for exercising enforcement discretion in situations when compliance is not achievable within the requisite time frame and the operation of a unit is needed for reliability. As proposed, the emissions guidelines for existing steam electric generating units and gas-fired combustion turbines will be implemented by the states, and it is they who will work with the owners and operators of these existing sources, as well as with the public and other stakeholders, in a planning process that will help states determine how to take advantage of the flexibilities across the universe of affected sources and, among other things, anticipate potential contingencies. We've already started down the road of participating in our own efforts as allies of counterparts and partner entities to address reliability. Earlier this year, in March, in fact, EPA Administrator Michael Regan and Secretary of Energy Jennifer Granholm issued a joint memorandum of understanding to provide a framework for interagency cooperation and consultation on electric sector resource adequacy and reliability. The MOU outlines activities to monitor and share information to support the continued reliability of the electric system, including regular outreach and consultation with FERC, with NERC, and other reliability electricity grid-focused entities. In May of this year, under the auspices of the MOU, DOE, with FERC staff in attendance, met with NERC as well as with representatives of the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners and several individual state PUCs in order to review reliability concerns and identify the challenges that they were facing. And in September, again under the auspices of the MOU, we met with members of the RTO-ISO Council to review similar topics. We are undertaking extensive reliability-focused outreach specific to the proposal. And following the end of the comment period for this proposal, we initiated conversations with 23 grid operators and balancing authorities engaged in our rulemaking docket. We have had numerous productive meetings with these stakeholders over the course of the last few months, which have helped us to deepen our understanding of the comments that we've received on reliability issues and to continue to learn more about reliability challenges arising in diverse regions of the country. I want to thank personally everybody here today who answered our call and met with the EPA team as part of this vitally important reliability-specific outreach, which will certainly not conclude here. In fact, I like to think about us as being maybe in the 5th inning of this process. We haven't even gone to the bullpen yet. So there's a lot of work that we still understand that we must do on the path to finalizing these rules. and we are committed to engage with reliability stakeholders as we develop the final rule. We plan continued engagement with FERC staff, lucky you, with grid operators, balancing authorities, and reliability institutions to guarantee that we have detailed and up-to-date information on the reliability implications of the proposed rule. Moreover, we, as regulators of air pollution, have multiple tools at our disposal to ensure that the rule will help reduce emissions leading to some of the most extreme weather events, and will do so without impairing the ability of grid operators to ensure the reliability of the bulk power system. We look forward to continued engagement, beginning with our responding to questions during the balance of this panel and hearing your thoughts, concerns, and most importantly, your advice on what kind of follow-up we should be doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Goffman. Chairman, I'd like to turn it over to you and the Commission for follow-up.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Goffman, for your testimony here today and for being here again. You know, you touched on this briefly during your testimony, and I appreciate and I applaud you for your commitment to continuous engagement, especially on reliability of the proposed rule going forward. But could you tell me a little bit more about what reliability assessment you did in preparation and preparing for this proposed rule?
Thanks for asking that question. I'm afraid that I may give you an answer that takes as long as my prepared statement because of EPA's understanding of what reliability is, which is every bit as much as a process, and for us, a learning experience in terms of what we need to do to support that process. So formally, in the proposal, we started out, and I think we described it in some detail. In the proposal, we started out by doing what we call a resource adequacy assessment. And we do that for the sake of determining at a first pass whether or not what we're asking the power sector to do is too much. In other words, whether it's going to exceed the capacity of the power sector to maintain generation. The reason we do that analysis is actually to feed back to ourselves whether we need to change the standards for some of the affected sources or extend compliance timelines. And I think you'll see in the proposal itself a discussion of a series of steps we took once we did that resource adequacy analysis. We made some changes in the compliance timelines that we proposed. I believe, if I remember correctly, we also asked for comment on alternative approaches that would reinforce or fortify any determined ultimate conclusion that the requirements were commensurate with our resource, our determination that that the proposal or the requirements or the timelines didn't undercut resource adequacy. We did a technical support analysis or put together a technical support document that reflected our own dispatch modeling of the proposed rules, and we also continued consultation with FERC staff and DOE staff and others. And since this is a proposal and not a final rule, in many ways our approach was to sort of set the stage for the kind of ongoing inquiry we need to continue to do to finalize something that works to meet what I described as the dual objectives, effective emissions reductions and the comfortable maintenance of a reliable supply of affordable electricity. So in a way, what we refer to as our reliability analysis, or really a resource adequacy analysis, was to create a framework for further discussion. I'll say one more thing, at least, which is that we understand that the a main nutrient, or if you will, the lifeblood of reliability maintenance, is planning, and then applying plans to changes that might need to be made in the sector. I happened to be lucky enough to catch Commissioner Danley yesterday afternoon, who reminded me that a lot of the measures that reliability entities and system operators identify require lead time. And so we're going to focus on that and feed back into the final rule changes that we might need to make to provide either time flexibility or requirement flexibility in order to accommodate, for example, that lead time, so that reliability entities can respond to their planning and identify measures that need to be taken.
So what I'm hearing from you, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that you saw this as a framework that was put forward. You're having this discussion, ongoing engagement, and that you're open to hearing feedback and implementing that in the final rule.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we put the mercury and air toxic standards final action together and the Good Neighbor Plan final action together, the real kind of lived experience of the professional experts who are to my left and to my right and in large numbers back at headquarters was that reliability is a process, and for the purposes of what we need to know and do when we do pollution regulation, is that we have to be in dialogue. And and we were doing our best in the proposal to try to structure that dialogue.
That's helpful, and I think that's fair. Another question that's come up a number of times I've seen it is, how does the proposed rule take into consideration that there are technologies that a lot of people question whether or not they are broadly available or they've reached some type of commercial class mass use? How does it take into consideration that it may take longer for these technologies to get to scale than anticipated? How do you respond to that?
I think there.
Microphone.
It's a little bit like looking at the question through a prism, because different, there's a multiple answers that kind of are true at the same time. At one level, the first question we have to answer is, what's the best technology available for reducing a specific pollutant? That's answered in terms of how effective it is at reducing pollution, how much it costs, how workable it is. What we do once we answer that question and identify technologies, in this case, CCS for larger, longer-lived, more heavily used facilities, we then turn that into a standard. And then it is handed off, if you will, to the states to figure out how to meet that standard, looking not just specifically at the technology that we identified as answering the best system of emission reduction question, but any number of other compliance options that reduce pollution so that, if you will, the state can meet its overall reduction obligation, or more specifically, can define requirements for individual sources so that they have a choice as to how to meet their reduction obligation. Now, we're doing this in the context where the technologies we proposed met the best system of emission reduction test are also being significantly supported through a toolbox that Congress put into use through the Inflation Reduction Act. So utilities have and states have the benefit of federal support in the form of various incentives and investments in the specific technologies that we identified. In this case, CCS and low GHG hydrogen, and a number of other clean energy technologies that utilities may choose to or prefer to avail themselves of by way of meeting their overall, emission reduction requirement. So the answer is technologies that we said are BSER, best system of emission reduction, are getting a lot of help and a lot of investment from congressional legislation. And other technologies that might or are on the menu of compliance options are also getting significant support as well. So from the perspective of the state or the utility, there's a lot of choice.
Well, thank you. I know that the Department of Energy has invested a lot in some of these resources. It seems like there's an announcement almost every other day of some type of investment. And I'm sure that there will be more discussion on this issue, especially around the two technologies that you mentioned. I want to shift gears a little bit. You mentioned in your opening that when you considered the Good Neighbor Rule, you met with the RTOs, ISOs, got feedback from them, and incorporated that feedback back into the rule. We have here 4 ISOs and RTOs, PJM, MISO, ERCOT, and SPP. They provided pretty specific recommendations to address potential reliability concerns. I'll read a little bit about them here. One, a subcategory of reliability needed generators that would need to stay in operation even if they fail to meet a standard. So basically provide a list of, these are the generators that we just have to have. Establishing a regulatory check-in to monitor whether the rules, timelines, and deadlines are being met. So if these technologies are slipping, they're not coming on as quickly as we think they should or would, then you would get an opportunity to get that feedback and adjust your rule. And the last one here, I have these, I can use them. Providing for interstate allowance trading for flexibility. Can I just get your general reaction to these very specific proposals that have been put on the table, if you have any reaction?
This was in the context of the Good Neighbor Plan, or just for this?
That's for this rule that we're discussing today.
Okay. The reason I asked is that this sounds, this sounds a lot like I like the discussions we had when we went from proposal to final with the Good Neighbor Plan. At a first pass, and without the benefit of thinking about it and talking to my expert colleagues, those all sound like ideas like we're going to get 2 shots at the system, or the rule is going to get 2 shots at addressing and adopting those ideas. We could easily find ourselves, after further discussion, incorporating them in options we give states for how they can meet their requirements. And then, of course, the second shot is at the level of the states themselves. One of the things that we are hearing a lot about since the proposal is that states and utilities and system operators would like to know a lot more than what we actually put in the proposal about what options they have to adopt so-called flexibility mechanisms. And that can include, averaging emissions over multiple sources, or even trading emissions allowances under an emissions budget. The Clean Air Act already gives states the authority to look at individual units, look at their remaining useful life, and other factors which would allow the states to conclude that individual units need to be put on either a different schedule or be required to meet different requirements. So those we can, if you will, capture those ideas in at the federal level and at the state level. Now, it just so happens that before the end of this month, if all goes according to plan, we ourselves are going to be going to a meeting that's being hosted in Valley Forge by PJM, where I'm confident, in fact, now I'm going to insist that we get our own chance to talk to the ISO as an RTOs to really process those ideas.
Thank you. Very glad to hear that you're going to Valley Forge and meeting with PJM. I'll stop right there. I want to make sure we leave enough time for my colleagues, and I'll turn it over to Commissioner Danley.
Thank you. So we had a nice chat yesterday, and I outlined what my concerns were about the way the markets would have to respond to a rule of this scope and the consequences for it. And the basic point that you had raised before, that you rely in part upon the track record of having set these standards in the past, I don't believe it's fully applicable. And so I'm going to recite a little bit of what you and I talked about, but that's for the benefit of everybody here. The situation we find ourselves in now is one in which vast swaths of territory in America have their power provided to them by the wholesale markets. And the wholesale markets have, in large measure, taken over the responsibility for resource adequacy that had historically been that of the states. So in the old days, when you had vertically integrated utilities under the watchful eye of the state PUC, they would get a standard of some kind, some regulatory burden put on them, and it didn't really matter what kind. It could have been labor, employee, it doesn't make any difference. They would implement those requirements that were imposed upon them. Then they would go to their PUC and get recovery for the costs that they incurred for them. We are in a different situation now in which we no longer have in the markets, well, all of the markets are different, and so I'm speaking in broad brushstrokes here. But markets like PJM, ISO, New England, they don't have the integrated resource plan mechanism in the same way that the vertically integrated states did in the old days to ensure resource adequacy. They don't have the same cost recovery mechanisms. And so one of the assumptions that was built into the rule is that, and I'm not going to get the wording exactly correct, or in the proposed rule, is that the rule assumed that between the balancing authorities, or RTOs, however you refer to them, and the states, that there would be orderly retirements. And I think that that is an assumption that probably bears a bit of reexamination. We heard at the earlier panel this morning, the first one, that in the case of MISO at any rate, and that's about the most vertically integrated old model of the markets we have, that they are not always aware when retirements are coming, and in part that's driven by the business interests of the companies that are running them. Sometimes there's even an allusion to requirements under securities law that make it impossible to share that information. And we also have the problem that some of these assets are not a matter of resource adequacy, which is what your TSD talked about, but instead they are a matter of reliability, which seems not to have been a subject that was independently examined in the aggregation of the record to date, right? There are resources that have attributes. This isn't just the number of megawatts, right? It's the attributes that are necessary to keep the system functioning. And when asked about whether these retirements were manageable, we learned earlier that it wasn't that easy to do it, and that even the RTO had trouble. And we've had reports from various RTOs, in fact, almost all of them, that they've had unexpected retirements at rates that they didn't anticipate. I also think that the likelihood that the IRA this is another assumption, that the IRA is actually going to get its full implementation is probably pretty low. We see that there are many people chasing the subsidies that are in the IRA, but if you look at the interconnection queues that are the gateway through which you have to go to get interconnection in order to grab hold of those revenue streams, it's harder to do than I think maybe people think. And the question, I guess, that I'm all leading to here is that given that we are in this different system where it's the market mechanism that procures capacity through market signals, and that itself has problems. We even have a market in ISO in England, which we were told at a technical hearing recently that the regulatory regime was such that they're unable to use market mechanisms to ensure resource adequacy. I don't know that the orderly retirement process is quite as robust as you may think. And so I'm just interested in hearing what your thoughts are on that.
Well, good. It feels like we're picking up exactly where we left off about 24 hours ago. I think you won't be surprised to hear me say now what I said when we talked yesterday, which is I look forward to continue to wonk out with you about this stuff, because we had this conversation, and it's not just wonkery, it's actually, you know, where the rubber meets the road in terms of the goal of delivering a reliable supply of affordable electricity. One of the things that, the question we were discussing was, did what we learned in 2011 when we designed MATS and then in 2012 and in subsequent years implemented it, you know, apply today? And I think, as you just did, you provided a lot of information in answer to that question as to how much the structure of the system had changed. That the way markets and other parts of the apparatus worked 12 years ago didn't necessarily apply now. And what I'd like to do is actually follow up on this discussion. You know, you've laid out a lot of issues that I think we are going to have to address in terms of how we account for potential retirements or the retirements that are either occurring or are projected. And I think we're going to take back as homework looking at some of the points you made just now and made when we talked yesterday. And a number of the points you raised yesterday and just now are also in our comment record. You know, a number, at least a plurality of commenters have raised these issues with us, and ultimately, I think what we're going to have to do is go back to the features that we proposed in terms of compliance timelines, the way we subcategorize facilities that have different functions, maybe in terms of the stringency, and provide more flexibility, perhaps, in order to accommodate these changes. You know, because this is very much a work in process. What I'm hearing is that the kinds of system management challenges that that system operators are facing, you know, are not quite the same as they were 5 or 10 years ago, and that the tools and information that they may have been able to rely on, say when we did MATS, may not be the same. And so we have to become more informed, more educated about that, and then figure out how to feed that back into the design of the final.
Yeah, the markets are always changing and the circumstances are different. So I have a ton more questions. I will hand it back to you. I want to say thank you, and I really do hope that we're going to keep talking, and I hope you come back again to discuss this further. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Danley. Commissioner Clements?
Thank you, and thank you for being here and for that presentation. You know, I was reflecting as you're speaking, Commissioner Danley, and I think regardless of whether or not EPA takes action on a rule under 111, we face the challenges you laid out. We face the need for markets to evolve, to send the right signals, to provide resources with the revenue certainty, and to provide services we need, right? That's within FERC's jurisdiction, and is in need of change before we even get to this policy. Next steps on interconnection, implementation of the rule we've put out. That's, you know, within FERC's jurisdiction, and we need to keep going regardless of whether or not you will issue a rule. Retirement planning, adequate notification, which in the past may have been more orderly and easy, right? And thinking about what regions and utilities are required to do in anticipation of retirement. Those things are all within FERC's jurisdiction. And so we have the tools in the toolbox, and certainly the needs and the circumstances on the system have changed. And so we might need to evolve those tools and add more tools to them. Fortunately, over the last 2 decades, there's been a lot of growth, right, and understanding. So I'm pleased to kind of put that into perspective related to the role of the various agencies for implementing their missions. I wanted to follow up, Joe, on one thing you said in terms of this isn't your first rodeo. You've done this before with MATS and had, successful implementation without material reliability concerns on the grid. You've done this when the Clean Power Plan was proposed, appreciating it didn't get to final, the goals were met anyway, without material reliability concerns. And as Commissioner Danley said, of course, the circumstances are different now. Can you tell me a little bit about the lessons you learned on this coordination front, a little more specifically with other agencies, with stakeholders, with utilities, and what things are still relevant related to ensuring reliability and the piece that EPA has responsibility for?
Actually, thanks for the framing of the question and the question. I think we're learning that we're learning how much has changed in say since we did MATS, and in the same year we did something called the Cross-State Air Pollution Rule, which was quite different from MATS, but a different set of pollutants, but exactly the same sources. Very often EPA's rules are the center of attention, but they're never the center of the ultimate mechanism and system for ensuring reliability. So I'm going to sort of state what we learned in terms of the questions we still have to ask and get answers to. And I'll use, say, the Good Neighbor Plan as an example. The Good Neighbor Plan is like version 3 or 4 of an overall emissions budget and allowance trading system. And in the earlier rules that we did that used that device, we could rely on the inherent flexibility of sources being able to trade allowances or bank allowances in order to kind of, if you will, leave it to the system to make its own decisions about what was required to ensure reliability. Now we're learning what you and Commissioner Danley both pointed out, that the pace of retirement is different from what it was 5 or 10 years ago, and if you will, the friction in the system that I think you all are preoccupied with, which involves transmission and transmission queues, mean that we can't just set up say a market-based system and then sit back, or just assume in the case of 111D that states will choose to do that and sit back. We have to go back and look at the new conditions that are emerging and look at what tools we have as regulators, as air emissions regulators, to provide more flexibility, so that if states and system operators have to be more interventionistic, or if they're facing friction or gaps in information that they have to respond to more quickly, we have to adjust the menu of tools, or the flexibility tools in our toolbox to accommodate that. So, for example, you sat through my listing 5 or 6 features of this particular rule. Well, a couple of them were imported from MATS, but several of them, in terms of just how we define the fundamental obligations of different groups of sources, were intended to accommodate changes in the system that change the problem statement for system operators.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Is there anything FERC should be doing on this front? That you're asking us for feedback to you. Can you help us help you?
The most important thing, I certainly don't think we have quite the expertise that you would hope we have to tell you specifically what, quote, FERC should be doing. most important thing from EPA's perspective, and given our mutual mission here, is answer the phone when we call with the next round of questions that we're going to have. Again, as you know, I mean, I kind of see us between now and final as, you know, going through the circuit several different more times, looking at our record, looking at questions that commenters raised, going to the RTOs, the ISOs, the utilities, the balancing authorities, and then coming back to you and your staff to get your insights and feedback in terms of helping us interpret what we're hearing and how we can then translate that into the provisions of the final rule.
Thanks for that. I just had one more question. You spoke a little bit to this, but you did see there is a record now on this proposal, and as you mentioned, you're somewhere in the middle of the game. Are there any points so far related to concerns about reliability that stand out to you, or that you would note is top of mind right now?
I think a number of commenters have focused on the compliance timelines, particularly if, you know, again, at two levels. One, have we defined the best system of emission reduction in terms of technology and how quickly it can be applied? And then if states choose to base individual unit requirements on, say, CCS or hydrogen, how quickly can the supporting infrastructure be built out? And if projections about that turn out in the event to be wrong, are there adjustment mechanisms? That's a central feature. Again, the other, you know, sort of genre of feedback is, you know, that I'm sort of putting words in the mouths of various state commenters and some state regulators that Tomas and I met with out west a couple weeks ago, is they basically said, you know, you guys and other rulemakings have been very forthcoming about the options we as states have to include flexibility or market mechanisms in our state plans. You've been reticent in this proposal. Please engage with us more on that, because I think there's a lot of states now have experience doing air pollution control regulation using those mechanisms, and they have an appetite to understand how they might be applied again when they get the baton to implement the final rule. So those are two, you know, big categories. You know, there are other, you know, the comment record includes 3 or 4 other items that nicely set the agenda for us to go through in follow-up conversations, specifically around the overall practicality of the rule and reliability issues.
Great. That's helpful to understand. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Christie?
Yeah, Mr. Goffman, welcome, and I want to acknowledge you and I did talk, like I said, a year and a half ago. You called me up, and we had a nice Teams call. Hope it wasn't recorded. But appreciate the reach out.
Nevertheless, I remember every word you said.
Okay. Well, apparently it didn't have an effect. But
we're still trying, Commissioner Christie.
Yeah, well, but I appreciate your reach out. And as I recall, I think most of our conversation was about the cross-state ozone rule, not about this one, which was still in your eye of the beholder. But let me just ask a couple things. You use the analogy that right now you're from an APA standpoint, or you're in the 5th inning, and which is good to hear. I'm going to presume that since you're in the 5th inning, you would like the record of this proceeding today to be shipped to you to be part of that record, correct?
Sure, yes. Okay,
great. Because we got a lot of speakers coming up this afternoon, I think, are going to comment on it. Let me ask you about this, and this follows up on our conversation last summer. And you used another analogy or metaphor that you wanted a glide path to compliance. And to get that glide path to compliance, the generating units that are going to be affected by it, of course, have to get financing. they have to get financing. If they can't get financing, it's not going to be a glide path. It's going to be a nosedive from 50,000 feet. So let's talk about financing, because that's a big issue. About, you know, you can have timelines, you can have alternatives, you can have all this, but if the units can't get financing, they're going to shut down. Most of the units in America are, well, I'm not going to give a number on them, but many of them are in, as previous colleagues here have mentioned, they're in markets. And to get the ability to finance compliance costs, they've got to get revenues from the markets that they're in. Have you all analyzed how many gas and oil, gas, oil, and coal, but primarily gas and coal, units would be able to get financing from the market structures that we have, or else they would retire?
That's a really engaging question.
Because if they can't get financing, they're going to shut down. It's that
understood.
Simple.
I'm not sure that we specifically analyze the question in those terms. I think what we looked at, as my colleague was just reminding me, is the policy environment in which that would play out.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly what we focused on was the tax incentives that are already on the books and then were enhanced and extended under the Inflation Reduction Act. I think it would be an overstatement if I said we analyzed whether or not they could get financing, but we did point to some of the advantages that Congress was trying to create in the form of, say, tax incentives,
Mm-hmm.
To boost the prospects of financing.
Okay, well, I'd say that's a huge issue because, again, if a generating unit cannot get financing to comply, all your timelines don't matter. They're just going to shut down. The other way of financing is rate base. Have you analyzed how many units are in rate base and how they're going to get financing? Because they have to go to state regulators and get approval. Because, as we had this discussion, when they go to rate base, consumers are going to pay every nickel. So they got to go to state regulators and get approval. Have you done any analysis on the units in rate base? How many of them will be able to obtain financing?
I don't think we looked specifically at that question.
Okay. The energy mix right now in America is about 60% coal and gas. What do you foresee 10 years from the implementation of this, if this rule went into effect today? What would be the percentage of coal? Right now, it's 60% of our generating resources are coal and gas. What do you expect it would be in 10 years?
I actually think that somewhere in my notes is a specific answer to that question. I'll ask my colleagues if they can pull it up faster. We did do a couple of projections. One, a baseline projection, what the change would be without this rule, and then what kind of incremental impact the rule would have. What we projected, and I'm going to answer in qualitative terms because you probably don't want to watch me shuffle through my notes.
No, you can shuffle all you want. I'm not kidding.
Well, if we stick with the fifth inning analogy, I hope you'd be open to our getting back to you with more specific information. But we saw that the impact of this rule as being modest at best in terms of relative to our baseline projection in terms of, say, retirements of coal capacity.
Modest?
Sorry?
Modest?
This rule, our baseline projection, this was relative to what we projected was, if you will, going to happen anyway.
How about relative to what exists right now, which is 60% of our capacity is coal or gas?
Relative to today, do we have an answer to that?
Because that's what we have right now.
Yeah.
Okay, you can submit it if you can't get the number right now. Okay. All right, no further questions, but I'm sure we'll hear more.
Thank you to our panelists. We are a little bit over time. We're going to take a 5-minute break to change over the panels and see you back here, hopefully sharply at 2:28.